Hello, everyone, and thank you for your time this morning to participate in the August edition of our PEP Police Academy Law Enforcement Training Webinar. My name is Chris Cadwell. As the PEP Pool Coordinator of the Public Entities Pool of Ohio, I want to welcome you to the fourth Law Enforcement Educational Webinar for 2021. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping matters to briefly go over. First, we'll be running a live Q&A at the end of the webinar, so we've enabled our chat feature. Access to the chat is located on the bottom of your screen, so if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to drop them in this feature and we'll address them during the live session. At the conclusion of the webinar, an evaluation form will automatically pop up in your browser as soon as the webinar ends. Please take a moment to share your thoughts on the presentation so that we may continue to provide the most meaningful experience for our members. If you miss anything, don't worry, we'll be providing access to the on-demand recording as soon as it is available. With that, as we all know, PEP is a member-focused and operated group self-insurance pool serving over 575 public entities. During the last 30 years, PEP has been committed to extending and strengthening its member service programs, as well as improving resources and raising the quality of the member experience in these areas. As a strong supporter of risk management practices and procedures that reduce both the severity and frequency of loss, PEP's Police Academy webinars are prepared to create a collection of PEP member resources and services that work collectively towards this purpose. Our goal in conducting these educational sessions is to provide a learning opportunity that allows our members to become better informed on a variety of important law enforcement topics and issues through presentations and discussions led by experts. In order to best serve the law enforcement needs of our members, PEP's Police Academy webinars are: 1, policy-based with written materials authored by our partner attorneys from a national recognized Ohio law firm. 2, the issues addressed are relevant and current to local law enforcement agencies of all types and sizes. And 3, each one is available not only via these live sessions, but members can also access them on demand through the PEP website. Law enforcement agencies are constantly facing pressing and evolving law enforcement issues that need proper attention and action, whether it's a new requirement that involves implementing or revising policies and procedures, or legal situations involving unfamiliar or prevailing court rulings. To help members address these issues, these educational sessions are researched and developed by attorneys from the law firm Baker, Dublicar, Beck, Wiley, and Matthews. This partner firm has over 20 years representing political subdivisions in police liability defense litigation and carries with it significant experience representing political subdivisions throughout Ohio. As we move through 2021, you will find that our lineup of subjects and policies dedicated to this program are designed to connect you with critical challenges and themes confronting law enforcement in ensuring public safety in our communities. Today's webinar is the fourth in our 6-part educational series scheduled for this year. And today, we will take a closer look at crisis intervention and how proper training improves safety, increases access to mental health care, and results in fewer encounters with the criminal justice system, all helping to reduce costs to law enforcement agencies. Once again, leading the discussion, we are privileged to have partners attorney Gregory Beck and attorney Mel Lute Jr. to share their professional insight and experience in litigation pertaining to law enforcement matters. Mr. Beck handles business transactions and civil litigation with a special emphasis in the area of police liability and civil rights litigation for cities, townships, employers, and political subdivisions. While Mr. Lute's extensive experience representing political subdivisions, police officers, and law enforcement agencies has developed his comprehensive understanding of the complex constitutional issues facing modern litigants. And he is well versed in those constitutional law questions that surface when defending public entities. With that, let's get started. Greg and Mel, the virtual floor is yours, and we'll reconvene back for some final comments after the conclusion of today's crisis intervention webinar.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's once again, it's always a privilege for Mel and I to have an opportunity to speak with you and spend a little of your precious time talking about issues. And as Chris indicated, this is the fourth in our 6-part series of the year. And there was really sort of a planning that was set forth in doing this. Remember, our first session dealt with Fourth Amendment, and we always sort of return to that at the beginning of all of our discussions, and that is because the Fourth Amendment, of course, is the bedrock of all of our police activity, and we return to the mantra that there can be no unreasonable search and seizure to any citizen of the United States. That's sort of the foundation of the Fourth Amendment, and most of our encounters involve issues with the Fourth Amendment. And we also know that the Supreme Court ruled in the Torres case in March of this year that anytime that we stop anybody for any reason to control their movement through reasonable suspicion or otherwise, we've essentially seized them as defined under the Fourth Amendment. So we need to have reasonable suspicion, probable cause. We need to act in a reasonable manner. And so we started with the Fourth Amendment. We went right then into April to the use of force. And the use of force discussion is a multi-tiered discussion. And in fact, we're going to return to that in October of this year. But we wanted to establish the basis for that use of force because now there's great national attention on that. In June, then we moved into one sliver, one piece of this action of use of force, and that was discussing issues with respect to excited delirium and how certain individuals with whom we interact might have special problems that create a medical emergency. And now we're moving into even a thinner slice, which deals with crisis intervention. A lot of police departments have CIT or crisis intervention teams, and it's actually been around for more than 30 years. It's sort of important to understand the history because it's the philosophy behind this type of training that's very important. But in essence, this recognizes that there are individuals with whom we will encounter that have some incapacity related to some sort of mental or emotional either history or crisis that they may be undergoing. And if you have any takeaway from what we're talking about today, I want you to leave with these sort of numbers in your head. And that is that based on all of the statistics that have been accumulated over the last 30 years when this Memphis model had been implemented back in 1988, it's pretty clear that 20 to 25% of every police encounter is going to encounter someone with a mental problem, a mental incapacity, or a mental challenge. So think about that. I mean, if 1 in 4 people you encounter, 1 in 4 calls that you make, if you have 100 calls in a day, 25 of them potentially could deal with people with a mental incapacity. I mean, that is a serious issue. And so we need to find ways to deal with those things. And so that's what the CIT was designed for. And of course, it started back in 1988, and that arose from one of those situations that is always tragic. In 1987, there was a 27-year-old man who was having some serious mental issues, and a family member called the police and said that he was out of control. When the police arrived, he was knife wielding and wouldn't respond to the police officer's demands that he drop the weapon. He then lunged at an officer with the knife, and he was shot multiple times and died. He was an African-American, and all the officers were Caucasian, and that it created, a great response in the community, mainly because a lot of people in the community knew who this gentleman was. But the response was very positive in the sense that it created sort of an open-eyed study of what can be done. And so there was a collaboration that was done between the local mental health community, the mayor, the medical facilities, and of course, then the mental health issues were brought to light, and they created what is called the Memphis model. And the Memphis model is really a project that has sort of 3 pillars. And the idea is that there will be, first and foremost, community collaboration. There needs to be an understanding that there are individuals in our communities, every community, by the way, because this type of problem cuts across every strata. It's not limited to race or gender or age, ethnic background, or economic status. I mean, anybody, everybody can be susceptible to these sort of things. So it is a broad area that we need to look at. So we need to have community collaboration. So the first idea that they put together in the Memphis model was the idea that we're going to work in a coordinated fashion with the local medical community, because everyone recognized, even back then, that these are medical issues as opposed to police issues. The second prong is that there's a training program that's been adopted, and it's evolved over the years, but it is a 40-hour training program for law enforcement officers to give them some basic understanding of what's really going on. And then there are some consumer and family are brought into the decision-making process. That's the original model, but it has morphed somewhat since that time into some a more sort of practical prongs. And the first prong is normally the training prong, and that is educating officers on what to do, what to look for, and how to deal with people that are in a mental crisis. Because of course, those individuals generally don't have an ability to respond well to commands. The second prong, and the one that is becoming more and more important, is that there needs to be training and specialized coding at dispatch. I mean, the statistics are somewhat overwhelming. And this is another little takeaway that you need to have, and that is, and I'm reading from some studies that were about CIT over the last years, but the research indicates that the characteristics of the call for service is a strong determinant of the probability of the future act. And that sounds complicated, but what it really says is what dispatch tells the officers or those that are going to respond will normally dictate somewhat of the outcome. So if it sounds like it's a criminal activity, it's going to end up in the officers responding as if it's a crime. If the dispatch, however, indicates that it's a mental crisis, someone just needs help, it will also change the outlook of those that are responding. So there needs to be a coordinated effort with dispatch. And then the third prong, and one that Mel's going to talk about, has to do with there needs to be community involvement so that there is a readily accessible drop-off facility. I mean, when you think about what's really happening out there, the police officers that are confronting a situation with someone that has an incapacity, they need to be able to respond in a way that they can get that person help. And so their options sometimes are limited. They could take them to the emergency room, but they don't know what they're really going to get there. They don't really know who's on staff. If it's 2 a.m, you don't really know what's available. However, if there is a community-based facility that addresses and will automatically accept anyone that has some sort of mental incapacity, now we're moving in the right direction. And there is also, when we talk about these components, about how they work and the community involvement, there are some cities and organizations that are creating another very, very important component, and that has to do with an independent crisis response team that is separate from police. And the one I'm going to talk about a little bit is in Eugene, Oregon. And it has an interesting acronym. It's been around for almost as long as the Memphis model, and it's called CAHOOTS, which basically stands for the Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. You know, CAHOOTS is sort of the acronym. But the idea under that model is that dispatch will obtain the information with respect to the call, and they will dispatch to an independent crisis team that is funded by the city, but is independent of the police. And in Eugene, Oregon, the response team is a paramedic and a mental health counselor. And just to give you some perspective, in 2018, there was an interview that they conducted with NPR. They said that they had 24,000 responses in just 1 year. Now think about that. 24,000 responses taken off the plate of the police department, all of which fell within the realm of mental health need. And of those 24,000 calls, they said they only needed police backup about 150 times. So, and they don't wear Kevlar, they don't have weapons, they just show up with their experience and their medical kit, and it's actually working. So, you take away 24,000 calls from the police, which saves time and money and energy. And then, of course, there's a huge safety element, because one of the big proponents of the Memphis element and one of their big emphases was trying to de-escalate and avoid injury to police and individuals. You don't want people shot. You don't want them taken into custody where they're hurt. So in Oregon and in other places, they are using this sort of separate team to address issues that have been traditionally handled by police. And Their numbers are almost exactly like I said in the beginning. They suggest that of those 24,000 represents 20 to 25% of all of the 911 calls. So they're taking that off the plate. The other statistics that should be a little alarming to you is that there was a study done from 2015 to 2019, and in that study, 1,000 people generally were killed by police officers in the police officer's line of duty. And in that number, 25% were individuals suffering a mental crisis. So imagine what would happen if you could take that same 25% and then move them completely off the grid, or we could handle those situations in a different way. And that is really what the emphasis is. And when we talk about our training and when we talk about what we're trying to do, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that it's a dual obligation here. You want to provide the best services available for your constituents. You want to protect your officers and you want to protect the community. This type of training in dealing with people that have certain problems and specific problems that make them incapable at times to respond to normal officer orders and procedures is a real issue that we need to address. And it is one that we can no longer ignore. The second thing is that there is a liability component that you are somewhat diffusing by trying to implement a program that addresses this need. I mean, the worst spot that Mel and I can tell you're ever in a deposition with an experienced plaintiff's lawyer is when they start boring in on you on issues that we should know about. You know, if you have a situation where you've encountered someone in your community that has a specific mental challenge and that had a very bad outcome, and you don't have a CIT team, you don't have a CIT coordinator, you don't understand what that is, your officers are blank on that, you don't have any outreach to the community, it becomes a disaster. And the problem is, this is one of the issues that is on the rise because of this whole notion that we're seeing nationwide about addressing the training and funding of our police departments. No one really wants to defund the police departments. I think that what they're really talking about is trying to redirect those funds and that training in a way that actually has the proper outcome. And so the sort of our overarching discussion all year has been on situational training. You know, we need to look at, if we were trying to design a training model, we want to look at a model that addresses the actual issues that you're facing. One of the issues and one of the criticisms of CIT nationwide is that even though a lot of people have trained officers in this, they're still not coordinating successfully with community. And the example I'll give you is, this is a case, it's resolved, but you know, a situation where a call comes in the middle of the afternoon, beautiful sunny day, from a mother saying that her son is having a mental breakdown. He's running around the neighborhood half naked and he's out of control. He's bipolar, please help him. Don't hurt him, please help him. Literally, that's what was said. By the time our police officers arrived, several neighbors had already called in and said that this individual, an individual was running around and he was now localized on a neighbor's property, had forced himself into a car, and the neighbors could not extract him. And so by the time the police officers arrived, he's surrounded by neighbors, so he's very agitated. The police officers, though, had a lot of training, but I think they felt a little compelled to take action because of the surrounding neighbors and the situation that was presented. They didn't call EMS. They thought they could handle it on their own. They tried to communicate with the individual. He was a young guy. He didn't respond. So they did what every reasonable officer would do under that situation without a forward thinking of CIT training. They removed him from the car. And when they did that, his status then elevated from someone that was in the throes of a mental crisis to an extreme agitation, which then triggered excited delirium. And then after a 3-minute tussle on the ground, he was dead. And when we look at this through the hindsight, it's much easier. But if you tag this to the discussion we had in June about how excited delirium evolves and so forth, you see that there is a connection between a mental crisis, a mental problem, and then something that could escalate into something more difficult. Had we had someone that was trained in crisis intervention, they may have taken a completely different tact, or had you had people that were trained to come to that scene, the outcome probably would have been much, much different. And of course, the officers did their best, and they were devastated, as every officer is when the outcome is bad. And so even though we either don't have the training or we're not taking the training quite far enough. The model policy that we presented to you has certain whistles and bells in it, and it provides for a what we call a crisis intervention team coordinator. And that coordinator is responsible not only to set the policy and training and so forth of the officers to ensure that it's done, but also is to reach out to the community, to set up certain policies and procedures that would be helpful in these situations. I think the way this is evolving and the way this process is moving forward, we need to have great connection between our EMS and the medical health community. You know, your EMS folks, they could coordinate with their medical director to talk to who is available in the community to create a liaison so we can have mental health counselors either available or to set up a separate team or to coordinate with them. I mean, you know, we're going to have to start getting creative and thinking outside the box to address these issues, because once again, going back to these numbers, you are going to encounter these folks. And we show that we are looking at it, we're taking it head on, and we're doing our best to address these issues in the safest way and the best way possible. So, you know, as I indicated, you know, the community collaboration is really what's important. And so these are things that we need to move on. These are things that we need to press forward on, because without that community coordination, without an ability to provide service to these folks that are having these problems, we're going to run into just problem after problem after problem. Now, it's pretty clear. And again, think about the statistics. If you could de-escalate 25% of your encounters, or you could outsource 25% of those encounters, you are going to reduce everything. You're going to reduce, you know, all sorts of things. You're going to reduce injuries. You're going to reduce all kinds of encounters. But some of these studies are interesting. You know, officer injuries during responses to mental disturbances dropped 80% in Memphis. No big surprise. SWAT team call-outs were declined almost by 60%. Shootings in the community declined in Albuquerque. I mean, all of these things are true. All of these things happen. The use of the CIT, you know, model is a working model, and it will work, and it can reduce a whole lot of things. It's fewer uses of force, fewer injuries to officers, fewer injuries to consumers. I mean, all of these things. And of course, if we want to just take a quick peek at George Floyd, I think he was in what we would say some type of mental crisis. Imagine the difference. Imagine the difference in that encounter if there had been a mental health counselor right there or a paramedic right there when he was not cooperating to get in that car. I mean, that whole thing would have never even hit local news. Us would have just been simply transferred to a facility, to the emergency room. He would have been helped, and none of that tragedy would have occurred. But we need to use these terrible encounters that as a learning tool, because we can learn from it. And this is where the whole nation is moving. This is what our politicians, this is what our communities want to see. They want to see a positive impact. And imagine how easy it would be to push for these sort of things. I mean, if you were trying to push a police levy, and one of the things that you were trying to push is how I can better help the community. How can we better help those folks in our community that have problems, those people that are less fortunate, those people that might be suffering from some sort of mental crisis. We know we want to help them. We want to do those things. And so this is really, you know, sort of on the cutting edge and on the front line of what you need to do. Within the policy that we have suggested that you consider, there are specific things that officers need to do, but the big thing here, as you see, is 3 and 4. Request EMS at a minimum. At a minimum. I mean, paramedics, EMTBs, they're certainly qualified to make assessments. They may not have mental health training. It would be better if we could also have a counselor involved, but that takes planning, that takes time. But then number 4 is you have to consider the possibility that the individual may be non-compliant due to other things. And of course, when you add alcohol, when you add drugs, when you add a lack of proper medication to an overlying mental health crisis, now you've sort of escalated the problems. And, you know, our officers have to be sensitive to the fact that if I am not cooperating with you, if I'm not listening to you, it might not because I'm a criminal or defiant and I just, it's because I don't understand. I don't even know where I'm at. I don't even appreciate the danger that I'm being faced with. Number 5 suggests to determine if on-scene family members can provide information to assist. I mean, there are situations now, we're looking at some of these where they're, in one sense, if they bring family members there, they avoid, some terrible outcomes. And so these are all options that need to be explored, should be considered into your policy, and should be implemented to the extent possible. The whole emphasis on crisis intervention is de-escalation, and the de-escalation must happen on the front end. I mean, it needs the temperature needs to be brought down. You need to take time. Everything needs to slow down so that you can make a fair assessment. And Mel will talk about this a little bit when he gets into the issue of pink slipping and what options are available to us. Again, when you look at what de-escalation looks like, you wait out the individual, you move slowly, you create distance, remove distractions, and you prepare that this is going to take some time, which is again why if you had a separate response team, it would be much better, because you would then remove the police from that, whom then might be able to respond to a higher emergency or something else that's more imminent. And so all of these things sort of work together to provide the better product. Before I turn over to Mel, I just wanted to show you, this is interesting. This was just a Kent State study that I found. What Kent State did, they looked at the city of Akron, which is a larger metropolis. They studied their dispatch calls for 2 years, just to try to get a beat of what's going on. And what they found was that the CIT training, in other words, they were comparing those officers who had CIT training with those who did not. And this is just within the city of Akron PD and Summit County Sheriff's Department. And what they found was interesting. 33% more likely to transfer to an emergency, a psychiatric emergency service. In other words, more often than not, a CIT trained officer recognized the problem and said, we're not going to arrest this person. We're not going to take this person to the jail. We're going to give this person psychiatric help, and we're going to do it right now. They were more likely than others after their program. Can't see that. Sorry about that. To transfer to other treatment facilities. In other words, again, they're not going to take them to jail because that usually has dreadful outcomes. And then they were less likely to determine that a call did not need transport. In other words, they didn't just say, well, you're just on your own, figure it out, we'll let you deal with family members. They actually took the appropriate action. And so what I'm suggesting to you is, and what I want to leave you with is, again, if a high percentage of your calls are going to deal with mental crisis issues, we need to make sure that we have the tools available to do that. And that is what this whole CIT program is designed to encounter. So with that, I will turn you over to Mel, and he'll talk to you about the processes that you can implement to help you.
Morning. So we have the options, of course, when we confront people who are in a mental crisis as to what to do. And of course, we have our conventional situation where we are going to potentially take them into custody, but we also have other options. One of the options is to pink slip that person. And pink slipping is a situation where we can involuntarily commit the person into a mental facility. And you can imagine a situation where you're taking a person against their will, essentially, and you are putting them into a mental health facility for treatment. Greg talked at the beginning of this presentation about the Fourth Amendment and how it is implicated in virtually every contact that law enforcement has with the public. And the Fourth Amendment is absolutely hovering in the background when you are confronting a person who is obviously having a mental crisis. And so pink slipping is a colloquial term for basically involuntarily committing somebody in a in a situation where they are in a mental distress, they're a danger to themselves, they might be a danger to others, they might be unable to care for themselves, and the police officer is not going to take that person to jail. They're going to take that person to a mental health facility. And that is what this process is about. Now, because we are dealing with the Fourth Amendment, because we are involuntarily committing a person, there is a statute in Ohio that is very specific as to what the requirements are for police officers who are going to pink slip an individual. It's Ohio Revised Code Section 5122.10. And what it says is that you can't take a person into a mental health facility involuntarily. But if you do that, you're going to have to comply with this statute. You're going to have to document it. You're going to have to document it very specifically. And I want to talk a second about basically what you do with that. And what you're doing is you're conveying that person with this pink slip that says there are circumstances that allow you to take this person against their will, essentially. But the reasons are very carefully circumscribed within the statute. And the pink slip itself, the document, must say on it why you are taking this person into custody. And of course, the slip itself must have an indication on it that the individual represents a substantial risk of physical harm to themselves as manifested by any threats or attempted threats of suicide or self-inflicted harm. Now, we know, of course, that typically before law enforcement arrives, there's been a report, there's been a dispatch, there's been some information that has come to the officer. Then there's also what the officer sees, observes, smells, interacts with on scene with the individual. All of that can be taken into account when the officer is trying to fill out this form and trying to decide what the criteria is for this decision to pink slip the individual. Are they threatening suicide? Or maybe it's the second criteria, which would be potential harm to others, maybe recent homicidal activity or violent activity. And what has that person done to cause another person to be in reasonable fear or apprehension of violence? Then there is the third and fourth criteria, as you see on your screen there, that this individual may represent an immediate risk of some serious physical impairment or injury to themselves. And this is a gray area, but the person may demonstrate that they cannot provide for themselves as a result of their mental illness. And then the fourth is that they are in need of treatment because there's an imminent risk to themselves or to others. And the wrinkle here, I think, is as time goes on, we all know what's going to happen. We're going to have body-worn camera footage that is going to be recording the dispatch information coming over the radio to the police officer as he is en route to the encounter. Then they're going to the camera is going to show what the officer is seeing when he gets out of the car, what he's hearing, the behavior that is manifested, what is being reported to him, possibly by a caregiver, a family member, maybe a victim of that person's violence. All that stuff is going to be a narrative. It's going to be input that's coming into that body-worn camera that's going to be seen later, potentially, by a fact finder, by an investigator. And all that stuff is coming into the officer's decision-making process as to whether or not they have the ability under this revised code section, under the pink slipping protocol, to take this person into custody for mental health treatment against their will. And we know we value our liberty more than anything. We value our personal autonomy more than anything. We as a society, we revere those who are compassionate, particularly for the most vulnerable people in our society. I mean, that's a trait that we hope we imbue in our students, in our kids, in others. And so we want police officers to be compassionate to people who are in mental crisis, to be accommodating to them in a way that will allow them to keep their liberty. And so when we're going to take that liberty, even for a limited time, for purposes of getting mental health care for that individual, we've got to document it. We've got to document that decision-making process. And so that's why that pink slip is very, very specific, because we're about to take a step that is very serious. And then this next section deals a little bit with technique, with tactics. And in a situation that is dynamic, in a situation that is evolving with a mentally ill person or person in crisis, the pink slipping section 512210 imposes upon the officer a duty to use every reasonable and appropriate effort to take the person into custody in the least conspicuous manner possible. And again, we've talked a little bit about this in a previous seminar dealing with excited delirium, but it's almost like the officer has a shift in approach where he says, I'm now in helping mode. I'm helping here. I'm helping you. And I need to help you by getting you the treatment that you need. So even though I'm a police officer, I've got a uniform on, and I may have to handcuff you, as it says here in section 2, the officer will identify himself, personalize himself, introduce himself, so that the individual knows they're having a human encounter and they're not just having an encounter with an institution. And that the officer tells the person they're being taken into custody, not as a criminal arrest, but rather for purposes of getting them an examination in a mental health facility. And that may in and of itself diffuse that very, very dangerous window where the officer's got to put hands on that individual, where you've got to get within arm's length of that individual to get them into a safe, a custodial relationship. Just identifying yourself by your name and your rank, telling that person they're not going to be under arrest for a criminal matter, but rather they're being taken into custody for their own care, to be taken to a hospital. That may be the entrance that you need to make that contact less of a problem in terms of resistance, having to use force, things of that nature. And the hospital is going to be responsible for treatment once that individual is secured, stabilized, and transported. But I think we all know that that's really the trick, isn't it? The trick is to de-escalate that very volatile scenario. Once the person realizes their liberty is going to be infringed upon for some period of time, what's their reaction going to be? How can the officer diffuse resistance in a way that's going to facilitate an orderly transport of that person to the hospital? In 2015, it's funny, this is a hot topic right now. You look online, you look in any major publication, the interaction between law enforcement and people in mental health crisis is a hot topic right now. But we can look back and see, even during President Obama's tenure, he had a task force back in 2015 that was forward looking as far as what is law enforcement going to look like in the future. And one of the main elements that came out of that 2015 task force was de-escalation has got to be not just a buzzword, not just an afterthought, but actually the reverse of that. It's got to be an organizational philosophy, and it's got to permeate basically every element of the law enforcement institutional knowledge, so to speak, in the way that the organization is going to deal with the public. In the New Orleans Police Department, they make that front and center in their organizational philosophy, de-escalation. It's part of their approach, and it's gotten out into the community. The community knows that. They know that the police officers have that as a priority, and it's starting to make a difference. You can see it statistically in the way in which the New Orleans Police Department has significantly reduced violent encounters with persons who are encountered in a mental crisis. Now, in Seattle, they take a little bit different approach. They're all about slowing the pace. That's since 2015, it's all about slowing the process down, creating space, creating opportunities for dialogue, humanizing the encounter, trying to get the suspect or the individual who is in mental crisis to see the law enforcement officer not as just a blue institutional element of oppression, but rather this person, a human being who's trying to do a job, who's trying to help. And the best way to do that is to lengthen the encounter, to slow everything down, to allow more options and maybe allow an opportunity to get additional resources to the scene. And again, not easy under a lot of circumstances, but it can be done. There was an article in a 2017 published in a police law enforcement publication that talks about de-escalation being a tactical element that can be employed. And when you read these, if this were described to the average person, this might give them a very different idea of how police react to people, particularly people in mental crisis. But this list that you see in front of you is interesting because these are the elements that are recommended: the respect tactic, the calm tactic, the honesty tactic, the empathy tactic, and even the compromise tactic. Now, and that's a tricky one because you're not compromising safety. You're not compromising your role because you got a job to do as a law enforcement officer. You're not going to give up what those obligations are, but you're going to make compromises at the time to reach that ultimate goal, which of course is to bring that person under control without harming them. You're going to have a listening tactic. You're going to reduce the power differential. What does that mean? Well, that means, maybe you're going to leave some of those elements that you don't need for your personal protection. Maybe you're going to leave those in the cruiser. Maybe you're going to put those down for a minute and try to talk to the person on a human level, still with the ability to protect yourself, but also letting that person know you're trying to hear them, you're trying to communicate with them. And finally, the empowering tactic. And this is one where you try to give that person that you're dealing with the impression that they can make choices, some choices within this very limited scope of the encounter. And again, whatever choices you're going to let them make, you're not going to let them compromise your safety or the safety of the public, but you're going to give them the impression that they've got agency, some agency that they can still recognize. They're not powerless. And that's very important when that person's in a mental crisis and they're holding on to reality by their fingertips. If you can give them just a little something, a little space within the realm of that encounter, you can be very productive. And the last thing that I'll just mention is in our training, we talk a lot about the force continuum. This idea that police officers can adapt the amount of force that they use in response to the force that is employed by the suspect or the subject of the encounter. They let the subject drive the level of force, right? The subject leads or escalates that level of force. What we're suggesting is that in the de-escalation realm, it's the opposite. That in the de-escalation, when you have that as your prime philosophy, you don't let the suspect or the subject drive the de-escalation. They don't decide where the de-escalation goes necessarily. The officer is going to lead with de-escalation. They're going to lead with de-escalation in the hope that that subject will meet the officer at each level of the de-escalation. At least that's the model, that's the concept. And it's our sincere hope that these studies that we've made reference to, these published articles, the science that has come in behind this will be the kind of support that police officers can draw upon when they start to go out and literally implement these forward-thinking, de-escalation first policies. Thank you. We'll open it up for questions at this point.
I don't see any questions on my end. with that, I guess, Chris, would you like to close us out?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Greg and Mel. Excellent as always. We appreciate your time and expertise in helping our members stay informed and for your lead in guiding law enforcement agencies toward well-established and up-to-date law enforcement policies and practices. Also like to thank our audience for spending time with us as well. If you'd like to speak to us further or have additional questions for the panel, please drop a note in the chat section with your name and email, and we'll reach out to you as soon as we can. Because we covered a lot of information this session, we want to be sure you'll be able to access this information at any time. So for your convenience, a follow-up communication will be emailed to provide access to the sample policy, as well as a link to the recording of this webinar, which will allow you to view today's PowerPoint presentation at any time. In addition, you can always check out our PEP Police Academy training catalog to see a complete index and description of all sample policies, along with dates and descriptions of each law enforcement webinar scheduled throughout this year by visiting our website at pepohio.org. We'll hope you'll join us for our next session in October when our PEP Police Academy Law Enforcement Series will focus on law enforcement employee misconduct issues. Finally, the PEP Board of Directors would like to thank you for your ongoing commitment, loyalty, and support. Whether you're one of PEP's long-term members or just recently joined the pool, PEP members play a crucial role in allowing PEP to provide stable and long-term insurance costs, communicate and educate on current and upcoming challenges in the public sector, and maintain PEP's incredibly strong financial performance. Thank you, everyone.